Before the world came crashing down on September 11th, 2001, there was a child. A child who had only just begun to form words, who still clutched stuffed animals, who spent her mornings in a garden with her father and her afternoons learning how to smile at the world. Her name was Christine Lee Hansen, and she carried hope, not only for her family, but, as history would show, for a nation that would one day grieve her as its youngest victim. Christine was born on February 22, 1999, in Boston, Massachusetts. She came into the world at the tail end of the 1990s, a decade many Americans now look back on as the last calm before the storm. The Cold War was over, the economy was booming, and terrorism was not the daily word it would soon become. In that setting, Christine's arrival was a joy. Her parents, Peter Burton Hansen and Sue Kim Hansen, were young, ambitious, and deeply proud. For them, she wasn't just a baby. She was their first and only child. Her grandparents, Lee and Eunice Hansen in Easton, Connecticut, doted on her. Her middle name, Lee, was given in honor of her grandfather, a man who would later carry the weight of telling her story when she no longer could. Not long after her birth, the Hansens moved to Groton, Massachusetts. Groton wasn't Boston, it was quieter, greener, slower. Peter and Sue wanted that for Christine: safety, community, and open spaces. Groton represented a classic American choice, moving away from the noise of the city to raise a child in an environment that felt like it would protect innocence. Neighbors in Groton would later say the family was warm, present, and eager to give Christine the childhood every parent dreams about: a safe yard, a family garden, and love. Accounts from her grandparents tell us Christine was gentle, curious, and affectionate. She was the type of child who would bend down to water plants with her tiny hands and then say out loud, "I bet you are thirsty. Let me give you a hug." She didn't see plants as just leaves and stems. She saw them as friends. That small detail reveals something bigger: her instinct to nurture. For a 2-year-old, that is extraordinary. She loved playing with her stuffed Peter Rabbit, often dressing it up or placing stickers on it. She had a red Teletubby doll, another favorite. For Christine, these were more than toys. They were companions. They carried her fingerprints, her stickers, her little voice whispering stories only toddlers understand. Her grandfather described her as love personified. Even at 2 years old, she gave hugs freely, always smiling, always reaching for connection. Parents with ambitions, a child with promise. Christine's father, Peter, was the vice president of sales at a software company. A rising figure in the tech world at a time when America's digital revolution was just beginning. Sue Kim, her mother, was a senior research technician at Boston University. She was the daughter of Korean immigrants, deeply intelligent, working toward higher academic goals. Christine's parents embodied the immigrant and American dream: education, work ethic, ambition. They weren't wealthy, but they were building something stable. Their future revolved around Christine. When they looked at her, they didn't just see a toddler. They saw kindergarten ahead, birthday parties, graduations, maybe even a wedding one day. That's what parents do. They project forward. They build their hopes into their children. It's important to remember the context. America in the late 1990s felt invincible. Parents in Massachusetts could reasonably believe their child's biggest danger was a scraped knee at the playground. Christine's short life unfolded in a country that believed it was safe, that terror was distant. For Christine, this meant bedtime stories, cartoons on Saturday mornings, and trips with her parents to the garden or the park. There's a reason her death would later strike such a chord, because Christine was the physical embodiment of innocence. Christine's grandparents, Lee and Eunice Hansen, were not distant figures in her life. They were central. Lee often recalled that she would run into his arms and cling to him like he was her world. The bond was so strong that when she was born, they knew they wanted her to carry the family name. Thus, Christine Lee Hansen. This bond mattered, because when the unimaginable happened, it was Lee and Eunice who had to stand before the world and say, this child was real. She wasn't a statistic. She wasn't passenger 54. She was Christine, our granddaughter, and she carried hope. Christine never had a chance to see kindergarten. She never got to walk into an elementary school classroom, holding her parents' hands. She never got to stand at a graduation podium. And yet, her story carries weight far beyond her 2.5 years. Because she represents something timeless, the idea that innocence itself can become a casualty. What makes Christine's story heartbreaking is not only that she died young, but that her very presence highlights how unthinkable it was. When people in Massachusetts, New York, and across the United States learned that a 2-year-old had died in the September 11th attacks, it cut deeper than statistics, deeper than numbers. It shattered the illusion that children, at least, might be spared. Why does Christine's story endure? It endures because she was not a soldier, not a politician, not even a student. She was a child, a toddler. And yet, she was pulled into history's darkest hour. Her life. From birth in Boston, to her home in Groton, to afternoons spent with toys and grandparents, became the fragile, irreplaceable backdrop to a tragedy the world would never forget. When we think of the United States in the late 1990s, it is tempting to remember it as a nation standing confidently at the height of its global power. The Cold War had ended less than a decade earlier, and America had emerged as the lone superpower, its economy booming, its culture spreading across the world through music, film, and technology. The average American family was not thinking about war, or insecurity, or the possibility of being attacked at home. They were planning vacations, buying new computers, and watching the stock market surge. But beneath that sense of prosperity and calm, there was a dangerous blind spot. The threat of terrorism, especially from groups based outside the country, was deeply underestimated, both by government institutions and by the public at large. To understand this blind spot, we need to rewind into the political and social atmosphere of the United States before September 11, 2001. In the suburbs of Boston, Los Angeles, or Chicago, families lived in neighborhoods that looked almost untouchable. The idea of a foreign enemy striking American soil was something most dismissed as unthinkable. The attacks on U.S. embassies in East Africa in 1998, or the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000, were distant stories, happening in countries many Americans couldn't find on a map. News anchors reported them, yes, but the urgency faded quickly. Americans went back to their daily lives, assuming their oceans and military power shielded them. Air travel especially reflected this attitude. Airports were busy but casual. Security was limited. You could walk right up to the boarding gate to hug your loved one goodbye. Carrying small blades, even box cutters, was not against the rules. Bags weren't screened with the paranoia we see today. The mood was trusting, almost careless, because nobody could imagine that commercial planes themselves could become weapons. Politically, the White House and Congress were focused on other priorities. In the 1990s, attention was on economic growth, welfare reform, and domestic debates like healthcare or impeachment proceedings. Terrorism was not dismissed entirely. There were intelligence warnings, scattered and often overlooked, but it was not the central focus of national security. When Osama bin Laden declared war against the United States in the late 1990s, it was not front-page news in most American cities. To the average citizen in New York or in California, it seemed irrelevant, happening in faraway deserts and caves. Even after the World Trade Center was bombed in 1993, killing 6 and injuring more than 1,000, the public perception was that it was an isolated incident, not a sign of a larger war being plotted. This attitude shaped policy. Instead of tightening security at home, the U.S. relied on its intelligence agencies abroad, hoping to prevent threats before they reached American soil. It was a gamble, and one that would prove catastrophic. Socially, America was enjoying a sense of invincibility. The internet was exploding into people's homes. Pop culture was dominated by optimism, blockbuster films, booming music, sports legends rising. Parents sent their children to school without fear of terrorism. The greatest concerns were school shootings, gang violence, or the Y2K bug that never materialized. And this is crucial. Families like Christine Lee Hansen's, living in Massachusetts, working hard, raising their children, existed in a culture that simply didn't prepare them for what was about to come. Christine's parents, like millions of others, had every reason to believe that a short flight from Boston to Los Angeles was as safe as driving to the grocery store. That confidence, that assumption of safety, was the defining mood of the United States before the fall. The story becomes controversial when we look at what was ignored. U.S. intelligence had received fragments of information, warnings from allies, and even direct signals that groups like Al-Qaeda were planning to strike inside America. Yet, those warnings were buried under bureaucratic delays, political distractions, and the assumption that foreign terrorists couldn't possibly penetrate the homeland. This underestimation would later be a subject of congressional hearings, fierce debates, and accusations of negligence. But at the time, in 1999 or 2000, the mood of America was different. Hopeful, forward-looking, and unsuspecting. It is precisely this contrast, between the calm before the storm and the devastation that would follow, that makes the story of 9/11, and of Christine Lee Hansen, so haunting. A nation that believed it was untouchable was, in fact, wide open. A government that thought it had time, did not. And families, from New York to California, who believed their children would grow up in safety, would discover just how fragile their world truly was. The United States in the year 2000 was a country in love with its own strength. And yet, within a single morning in 2001, that strength would be shattered, its innocence stripped away. Remember, terrorism did not appear out of nowhere. The signals were there, scattered like puzzle pieces across intelligence briefings and newspaper articles. But a nation convinced of its own security chose not to put them together. And in that silence, in that underestimation, the stage was set for what would become the darkest day in modern American history. Christine Lee Hansen's story reminds us that behind every tragedy are real people, real families, and memories that deserve to be honored. If you believe these stories should continue to be told with care and truth, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Together, we can keep history alive, remember its lessons, and ensure that voices like Christine's are never forgotten. But wait. I know you might be confused. Sit back to watch and understand the full story. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Christine Lee Hansen woke up like any other 3-year-old child. For her, this day was supposed to be an adventure. She was traveling with her parents, Peter and Sue Hansen, from Boston, Massachusetts, to Los Angeles, California. Their destination was Disneyland, a trip meant to mark her very first visit to the happiest place on Earth. For her parents, this wasn't just a vacation. Peter Hansen wanted to introduce his daughter to the magic of childhood memories he believed every child should have. Disneyland was a rite of passage, a symbol of joy, and they wanted Christine to experience it at an age when everything still felt magical. United Airlines Flight 175 departed from Logan International Airport in Boston at 8:14 a.m. It was a Boeing 767, carrying 65 people in total, passengers and crew who, like the Hansen family, thought of it as just another Tuesday morning flight. At first, everything seemed normal. Flight attendants served drinks, passengers settled in, and the hum of engines promised nothing more than hours in the sky. Christine, according to surviving relatives' accounts, was excited about the trip, likely distracted by toys or coloring books her parents brought along. She was 3 years old, too young to grasp what was about to unfold, but old enough to carry joy in her eyes. The hijacking. At approximately 8:42 a.m., the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Less than 20 minutes later, around 8:51 a.m., something went terribly wrong. 5 hijackers, armed with knives and box cutters, stormed the cockpit. Chaos erupted in the cabin as passengers were pushed back, and the crew was forced into submission. Christine Lee Hansen became the youngest victim of 9/11. She was only 3 years old. Her short life ended in a fireball above Manhattan, a life that had barely begun, extinguished alongside her parents. For many, the horror of 9/11 is often told in terms of statistics. 2,977 victims, 19 hijackers, for planes. But when you focus on the story of one child, a toddler clutching her stuffed toy on her way to Disneyland, the reality of what was lost becomes unbearable. Christine's innocence and her family's ordinary dream highlight the human dimension behind those numbers. At that same 8:52 a.m. on that day in the plane, Peter Hansen picked up an air phone from his seat on United Airlines Flight 175. The cabin around him was already in chaos. Hijackers had seized control of the cockpit, passengers were injured, and there was confusion, fear, and disbelief. Amid all of this, Peter did something deeply human. He called home. The call reached his parents, Lee and Eunice Hansen, in Easton, Connecticut. For them, it was an ordinary Tuesday morning. Eunice was in the kitchen when the phone rang. What followed would sear itself into their memory forever. Peter's voice was strained but steady. He told them that the plane had been hijacked. He explained that the hijackers had knives, that people were hurt, and that they seemed to be flying toward New York or Chicago. His words were not only informational, they were protective. Even in that moment, Peter was trying to prepare his parents, to soften the blow of what might come next. But the call didn't end there. It revealed the deepest, rawest layer of human instinct, the desperation to protect one's family. Peter told his father, Lee, that he believed the hijackers intended to crash the plane into a building. He said, "Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be very fast." Imagine the weight of those words. A son, 32 years old, holding his 3-year-old daughter in his arms, speaking to his parents hundreds of miles away, assuring them of a quick death. It was not false hope, nor resignation. It was a heartbreaking act of love, of trying to shield his elderly parents from unbearable terror. Lee and Eunice later said that they were powerless, listening helplessly, begging their son to hold on, to stay safe. But what could they say? The distance was unbridgeable. The moment was frozen in time. When historians analyze 9/11, they often speak in terms of geopolitics, terrorism, and national tragedy. But this phone call, one father reaching out to another, cuts through all of that. It was not about ideology or war. It was about a family, linked across a telephone line, in their final moments together. What makes it even more haunting is that Eunice later revealed how she could hear the fear not just in Peter's voice, but in the background. The sounds of panic, the confusion in the cabin, the chaos building second by second. Peter was calm, but it was the calm of someone who already knew the outcome. For Lee and Eunice, it was a conversation that would define the rest of their lives. The memory of their son's bravery, his composure, and his attempt to comfort them as he faced the unthinkable. Why this call matters. This phone call was later cited in investigations, congressional reports, and documentaries. But for the Hansen family, it was not just evidence. It was their last connection to Peter, Sue, and Christine. It turned their home in Connecticut into a place of mourning, their kitchen phone into an artifact of loss. The chilling reality is this. 9/11 was not just seen on television screens. It was lived in real time, through voices carried across phone lines. For Lee and Eunice, those final words froze time forever. When Peter said, "Don't worry, Dad," he was offering comfort in a situation where comfort was impossible. That small phrase carries more weight than entire history books because it shows us the truth of 9/11. Behind the towers, behind the fireballs, behind the headlines. There were families, words spoken in fear and love, and silences that could never be broken again. For the Hansens, there was no goodbye at the airport. There were no last hugs after the vacation. The call was their farewell, unexpected, heartbreaking, and eternal. At 9:03 a.m., millions of Americans watched live as United Airlines Flight 175 tore into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. In an instant, the country realized this was no accident. The first strike against the North Tower had left room for doubt. The second erased it. America was under attack. In living rooms, classrooms, and offices across the United States, people froze in front of television screens. Fear, disbelief, and rage mixed together as smoke billowed over Manhattan. The nation's sense of safety collapsed as visibly as the towers themselves would later that morning. At first, the victims were anonymous. The footage showed planes, towers, and fireballs, but not the human beings inside. Slowly, the details emerged. Families began receiving phone calls, reporters tracked passenger manifests, and one truth hit harder than almost any other. Among the dead was a 3-year-old child, Christine Lee Hansen. The revelation shattered the public in a way statistics never could. The idea that a toddler, traveling with her parents for a family vacation, had been caught in this web of hatred stripped away any illusion that 9/11 was a distant, abstract act of war. It was suddenly intimate, personal. A child's laughter silenced, her future erased. Commentators, community leaders, and ordinary citizens alike spoke of Christine. She became a symbol, not of politics or ideology, but of innocence destroyed. The American psyche was already scarred by the collapse of towers, but the knowledge that a little girl had been on that plane deepened the wound. It was not just adults in boardrooms or offices who were lost that day. It was children. It was families. It was the very fabric of everyday life. For many Americans, learning about Christine forced a difficult moral reckoning. What kind of enemy kills a child on her way to Disneyland? And what would America now do in response? As the smoke cleared and the nation began to count its dead, Christine Lee Hansen's name continued to echo. She was not just another victim of September 11th. She was the youngest. That single fact transformed her story into something larger than tragedy. It became a symbol, a point of collective mourning that helped communities give shape to their grief. In Massachusetts, where Christine and her parents lived, neighbors and strangers alike left teddy bears, dolls, and children's drawings at makeshift memorials. Parents who had never met the Hansens wept as if they had lost their own child. For them, Christine represented every child they tucked into bed at night. Her toys, stuffed animals, picture books, and even a favorite blanket became tokens of remembrance, reminders of an innocence forever stolen. Vigils were held, and prayers whispered her name. Across the U.S., Christine's story was retold in classrooms, church services, and family dinners. She became a way for people to process a catastrophe too large to grasp. The innocence of a toddler made the enormity of 9/11 painfully personal. Christine's legacy also took on a mythic quality. While the world debated politics, terrorism, and war, her memory reminded people what was truly at stake: the fragile lives of ordinary families. Communities clung to that truth, using Christine's story to heal, to unite, and to make sure that even in the darkest moment, the image of a smiling child would never be forgotten. The controversies that linger. When the towers fell, grief turned into rage. For many, the death of Christine Lee Hansen, a child who had barely begun to live, symbolized the cruelest face of terrorism. She became the human evidence that 9/11 was not only an attack on America's symbols of power, but on its most vulnerable. Yet as the years passed, grief alone was not enough. Questions began to swirl, debates intensified, and controversies ignited that still burn more than 2 decades later. Christine's story was frequently invoked in these debates. Politicians cited her name when discussing America's military response. Media outlets used her photograph when framing 9/11 as a moral crime against humanity. But for some Americans, this personal tragedy raised darker, unsettling questions about how and why such an event was allowed to happen. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories began to circulate. Some argued that the U.S. government knew more than it admitted. Others claimed 9/11 was an inside job, pointing to the speed of the tower's collapse, the security lapses at airports, and the intelligence warnings that had reportedly been ignored. To these theorists, Christine's death became a painful example of government failure, a preventable tragedy. Her innocence was often contrasted with claims of negligence. Couldn't a nation with the most advanced military and intelligence network in the world have stopped a hijacking involving a 2-year-old child? The fact that Flight 175 departed as scheduled, despite warning signs of suspicious activity, only fed these suspicions. The political divide. Beyond conspiracy circles, Christine's death deepened America's political divide. For some, her story justified aggressive military action abroad. They argued that if terrorists were willing to kill a toddler, then no response was too strong. For others, however, her death highlighted the cost of unchecked violence. Did using her story to justify war truly honor her memory, or did it weaponize her tragedy for political gain? This debate reached into every corner of American life, from dinner tables to university campuses. At the University of Massachusetts, students debated whether Christine's name had been co-opted by politicians. In churches across the country, pastors asked congregations whether vengeance could ever bring peace. The image of a child smiling in family photos was no longer just a private memory. It was part of a national argument over justice, morality, and the future of America's role in the world. Unresolved questions. And then there are the unresolved questions that linger to this day. Why did airport security fail so catastrophically? Why were intelligence reports about Al-Qaeda activity not acted upon? Why was Flight 175 allowed to continue into New York airspace long after the first plane hit? For many grieving families, especially the Hansons' relatives, these questions cut deeper than politics. They weren't abstract puzzles. They were life-and-death failures that ended with Christine's empty crib back home. While some Americans demanded answers, others chose to focus only on unity and healing, believing too much doubt dishonored the dead. Christine Lee Hanson's death became a paradox. She was both a personal loss and a political symbol. To her grandparents, Lee and Eunice, she was a granddaughter they would never watch grow. To American society, she was a reminder of innocence destroyed. And to conspiracy theorists, she was proof that something had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong inside America itself. In the end, Christine's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Even in national tragedies, the way we remember victims is never neutral. Her name carried hope, anger, sorrow, and division all at once. And as time passes, those lingering controversies remind us that 9/11 was not just about buildings or planes. It was about people and the many ways their lives and deaths are remembered. There are names etched into the stone of American memory. Some belong to soldiers, some to leaders, and some, like Christine Lee Hanson's, to children who should never have carried the weight of history. Christine was only 2 years old when she boarded United Airlines Flight 175 with her parents, Peter and Sue. She never had the chance to attend kindergarten, to learn to read, or to chase dreams of her own. And yet, her story continues to speak louder than many who lived long lives. For many in Massachusetts, Christine became the symbol of innocence lost. Her toys left untouched in her bedroom. Her tiny shoes that would never be worn again. Communities held vigils, not only to grieve but to remind themselves that terrorism is never an abstract political act. It is always personal. When the news revealed she was the youngest victim of 9/11, even strangers thousands of miles away wept as though they had known her. Christine's legacy is more than tragedy. It is a lesson. In classrooms across the United States, teachers have told her story to explain the human cost of global violence. Memorials in Boston and New York City carry her name, so that generations to come will understand that September 11th was not only about towers and planes, it was about lives interrupted. And perhaps most hauntingly, Christine reminds us that America's wound is not just about what happened on one morning in 2001. It is about the fragility of safety, the weight of decisions made by leaders, and the need to guard against forgetting. Every year, when her name is read aloud at memorial services, silence falls across the crowd. Not because she was famous, but because she was a child, and the loss of a child cuts through politics, ideology, and debate. 20 years later, when Americans stand at the reflecting pools in New York City, Christine's name is there among thousands. Tourists stop, trace the letters with their fingers, and learn her story. And in that quiet moment, her legacy continues, a reminder of innocence, of the human price of hate, and of the responsibility to remember. Christine Lee Hanson's life was brief, but her impact is lasting. She is not only the youngest victim of September 11th, she is a voice for all victims of violence who never had the chance to grow old. America's wound remains, but so does its memory of her.